3:17 a.m. Final boarding call for flight 442 to Maui. My boarding pass was damp from my palm. The letters on the ticket blurred into a small, ridiculous constellation of numbers. 30 place settings still sat empty under fluorescent lights in my kitchen back home, and somewhere between the oven clock and the guest list, I had decided I was done being the person who could be counted on to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of myself. 3 days earlier, Wednesday, 9:12 a.m., Vivien unfolded the guest list like it was a verdict. She had that soft, performative air she used when arranging table flowers or explaining a charity to someone new. Exact, decorative, and utterly unaware of the people whose elbow grease made everything look effortless. "We've upgraded this year," she said, smiling. "We're inviting the Sanderses, and Suzanne's bringing her bridge group. I've suggested we do 3 stuffings, apple and sausage, chestnut and cornbread, and 4 desserts. People expect variety." Her hands fluttered over the menu as if it were a menu in a restaurant, not my living room. I counted names on the printed list. 30 people. My mouth went dry in a way I hadn't expected. The numbers slid across my ribcage like a small, heavy stone. Isabella, that's me. 5 years of Thanksgiving dinners marked on my calendar like religious obligations. I'd made sure the turkey was golden, the side dishes arrived hot, the candles were straight. Guests always complimented the spread, never the preparation. Over time, "It's only a lot of work" had become a chorus I hummed to myself while my hands scrubbed pans. Hudson, leaning against the counter with his tie still on from a meeting, smiled and reached for one of the printed pages. He traced a line under turkey with 3 stuffings, as if underlining a punchline. "I'll carve the turkey and open the wine bottles," he said. He said it the way someone checks a box on a to-do list. That line, simple, casual, echoed louder than anything Vivien said that morning. He didn't say, "I'll be in the kitchen with you at dawn," or "Tell me how I can help." He said he'd perform the final flourish, the visible gesture of hospitality, while the work of getting to that moment, shopping, prepping, the actual cooking, would land where it always had, squarely on me. It wasn't that Hudson was cruel. He loved me. He just had not learned to weigh the invisible hours. In our marriage, my competence had become the thing others relied upon. I cleaned, coordinated, negotiated dietary restrictions, replied to texts about timing, and absorbed small crises into my schedule so that other people's comfort could stay uninterrupted. "So that's settled," Vivien said brightly. "Isabella will manage the kitchen, of course. She knows how you like things." Her eyes lingered on Hudson with that private matrimonial approval that made him flush in a way he liked. He laughed, diffident. "Of course," he said. He thought I was a given. No one asked if I wanted the job. On the drive home that afternoon, my hands remembered tasks as if by muscle memory: how to pluck sage, when to baste the turkey, where I kept my grandmother's wire rack. What hit me then was the scale on the page. An entire dinner for 30 people wouldn't be a day's work. It would be a week's sweat, if not more. The menu Vivien had dreamt up read like a restaurant bill of fare. Turkey with 3 stuffings, mashed potatoes for 30, glazed carrots, green beans with almonds, a creamed onion dish, a Brussels sprouts course that required crisping and finishing in butter, gravies and sauces, one of which needed to reduce all afternoon, and 4 desserts that weren't going to be boxed and served. They were meant to be exquisite. Pecan pie, which I had always been wary of because of my cousin Ruby's sensitivity to allergens, a flourless chocolate torte, lemon meringue, and a pumpkin cheesecake. Ruby. Her name landed heavy. She had been included on lists last year when Vivien was in a good mood, then quietly uninvited 2 years ago when Vivien decided the seating felt cramped. Watching that erasure, the small exclusion that Vivien downplayed with a breezy, "They'll manage," had hurt me in a way that felt like betrayal. Ruby's reaction had been sad, polite. She didn't make a scene, but I carried it because I had become the person who mended small social injuries as part of my job. I went to the store the next day, like someone heading into a battle. My cart bulged under the weight of produce, butter bricks, and tins of spices in numbers that made the cashier raise her eyebrows. Standing in the produce aisle, I texted Hudson the list of items that would need to be fetched late on Thanksgiving Eve: fresh thyme, unsalted butter, heavy cream. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. It was the most modern, efficient way he had to be present: quick, symbolic, and remote. At the checkout, Mrs. Suzanne, our neighbor, caught my sleeve. She was the kind of woman who noticed when your shrubs needed trimming and sent a casserole when your mother-in-law was ill. "You look tired," she said softly. "Do you need to sit down?" I laughed, a short sound that convinced no one. "I'm fine," I said, and the truth was complicated. I was used to being fine because I had to be. But there was a new feeling under the old, something like the chill before a storm. "You always do the big meal, don't you?" She watched me with practicality. "You were never meant for drowning, you know." The phrase lodged in me like a splinter. I pushed it away because splinters are inconvenient. That night I wrote an inventory in a small notebook I kept for big events. Oven times approximated, pans I'd need, which drawers held pastry brushes, a plan for staging dishes on the counter so that finished plates could be assembled quickly. I mapped out a timeline that began at 4 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning and read like an engineering schedule more than a holiday plan. By the time I finished, my rib cage felt knotted. 2 days to go, Thursday 11:22 a.m. I called Carmen, Hudson's sister, and the rare person who could say something brutally honest to Vivien without losing her temper. Carmen had a bluntness that was both terrifying and comforting. She had helped me once when a roast caught, and we turned the smell into a joke so quickly the guests never smelled the faint char. I told her the menu and the timing, because part of me wanted to hear a voice that could name the absurdity. She did. 30 people? She said. With that menu? Isabella, that's a production. You need help. I know, I said. Hudson said he'll carve the turkey and open the wine. Right, she said flat. He'll be the proud man at the end of the line with a knife and a grin. Exactly, I said, and it came out sour. I'm not opposed to that. I'm opposed to being invisible until the applause. Carmen didn't answer for a beat. Then she said something I'd been itching to hear. Call Vivien. Tell her you need 2 people in the full prep shifts, or set up a hires list. She wanted me to formalize the help. She was practical to a fault, and I loved her for it. I left her with the idea of hiring temp help, and then I spent the afternoon reading job postings for catering assistants, as if I were planning a small war. My inbox filled with quotes, and I bristled at the cost. I also recognized that every dollar saved by non-payment of labor was someone else's unpaid work. That night, Hudson came home with a bottle of wine and a small bouquet. He kissed me the way someone apologizes with gesture rather than words. Talk to me, he said. Tell me what you need. I named things: extra hands on Thursday morning, someone to peel 40 pounds of potatoes, someone to manage the dessert station. He nodded, true to his nature, then offered the line that had become a joke between us when we were tired. I'll carve the turkey and open the wine bottles. I wanted to laugh because the absurdity was near bodily. That's not help, Hudson, I said. That's the trophy ceremony. He opened his mouth. He was learning the language of my labor slowly and clumsily. Okay, he said. Leave it to me. I'll sign up to do dishes every night this week. I'll take your stove off your hands for an afternoon. This time he meant it. I put the words in the same drawer where I kept my hope, but I was wary. 1 day to go, Wednesday, 10:05 p.m. I slept badly. My dreams were full of pans stacking themselves in impossible towers, guests multiplying like a Greek chorus until I could not see their faces. At 3:12 a.m., I woke and stared at the dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum. It felt as if the house itself understood the scale of what I'd accepted. At 7:02 a.m., I started. I prepped mirepoix, seasoned turkeys, and began the long work of patience every cook learns. Attention to temperature, to timing, to the silent, invisible labor that makes a meal more than ingredients. My hands began to show what they had done. Small raggedness at the fingertips, flour under the nails, a softness from dish soap. The rhythm soothed me and wore me down at the same time. At midday, Vivien popped over with her pearls and a dramatic hat. She surveyed my staging like an art critic. "You've thought of everything," she said. "You always surprise me with your capacity." Her voice held admiration and, beneath it, an entitlement I'd grown used to. That afternoon, she slipped a small slip of paper across my counter. "I've made some last-minute adjustments," she said. "We'll be bringing a child from the Sanders family. They asked if anything could be nut-free." I felt my pulse drop to my fingers. Nut-free? I asked a dozen questions at once. Tree nuts? Peanuts? Was the child severely allergic? Did I need to set up a separate fryer? She shrugged then, as if allergies were a small checkbox. "She said it's a serious allergy," Vivien murmured. "But you know how these things get managed. Do you know how these things get managed?" The question was a sting. My mind, like a well-trained assistant, immediately calculated the risk. Cross-contamination with pies, slivered almonds in the green beans, pecan pie on the dessert table. Ruby's name flared up again. She'd had a reaction once, years ago, and people had been more careful after that event. I thought of moving everything to separately labeled trays, of wiping down surfaces in a clean way that's less dramatic than gloves and more precise than a napkin. I also registered Vivien's casualness like a physical blow. "How severe?" I asked. "Oh, quite sensitive," she said, distracted. "But we'll be careful." There was the problem. "We'll be careful" is not a plan. It is an aspiration. It is the belief that apology and good intentions can substitute for systems. That night at 11:58 p.m., as the kitchen laundry hummed and my freezer filled with components folded into aluminum foil, the phone rang. I answered without checking the number. It was Vivien, voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Isabella, darling," she whispered. "I forgot to mention Sanders' child, peanut allergy. I thought you'd known. I'm so sorry." I told her not to apologize, like that would make it easier. I told her we would rearrange desserts, separate trays, mark things. When we hung up, the tremor in my hands had moved from adrenaline to exhaustion. There was another call at 3 a.m., a different kind of warning. I was in bed, awake, rereading my timeline. The phone lit up again with Hudson's name. My thumb hovered before I pressed answer. "Honey," he said, voice thick with sleep. "Everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "Vivien told me 2 people are bringing pies with nuts on top." "We'll just not serve them," he said, the lightweight optimism of someone protecting his own peace. I thought of the work required to guarantee safety. Separate utensils, fresh oil if anything was fried, designated pans for nut-free foods, a series of cleanings that take more time and focus than the casual "we'll be careful" implied. None of that existed in Hudson's mental shorthand. "I don't think you get how complicated this is," I said. "I'll make sure it's fine," he replied. "I mean, we can just point stuff out to people. There is a peculiar kind of fear that slides into your voice when you are responsible for someone's health." I tried to explain the logistics of cross-contamination in a way that wasn't accusatory, in short directives. He listened the way someone listens to another language. He wanted the outcome, everyone fed, everyone happy, without stepping into the grind. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll take the kids out for a walk. I'll keep them away from tables after dessert." His plan was to keep children away from tables as if the world could be made safe with a casual escort. He was not being callous. He was being human in the way many of us are, seeing the visible piece and missing the foundation. I realized then that the problem wasn't malice. It was habit. I had been habitually the person who noticed the foundation. By Thursday, 2:07 a.m., fatigue had become a fog. I stared at the oven dial like it might confess some secret to make preparing 30 places less monumental. At 3:14 a.m., after another hour of imperfect sleep, I stumbled into the living room and found my suitcase. I had been, in quieter moments, imagining what it would feel like to be somewhere else. Not to run away from responsibility, but to test whether my identity was fused to my competence, or whether it could exist in a new shape, one that included rest. I did not plan a dramatic note. I did not write a manifesto. I packed a sundress the color of sunlight and a pair of sandals. The dress felt almost obscene in the middle of my island of foil-wrapped trays, but the idea of wearing something light and bright made my chest unclench. I left a small folded note on the counter because I am not the sort of person who can leave without some trace. "Hudson," it said, "I can't do this again. The turkey is Vivien's problem now." No flourish was necessary. My handwriting was small, the letters were blunt. Under the note, I left my phone with everything important accessible. I packed only what I could carry on to a flight. Hudson's Perspective, Thursday, 7:23 a.m. I woke to the phone buzzing and an empty bed. For a suspended second, everything was normal. The light through the blinds, the quiet of our street. Then I saw the note on the kitchen counter, the single sentence that made my stomach drop. "The turkey is Vivien's problem now." My first instinct was anger toward the audacity of leaving me with 30 people and a complicated menu. Then confusion. Then, this cut deeper, shame. How had I not seen the work? How had I said, "I'll carve the turkey and open the wine," and thought that was meaningful? The house felt suddenly enormous, and I could hear the ghost of casseroles blinking like a countdown. I called her number. No answer. I texted. Nothing. I looked at the tack of the note like it might move, like it could be unsaid. Guests began to arrive around 9 a.m. They were cheerful, carrying green beans and gossip. Vivien marched in with a hat and a smile that said she owned the set. I watched her set a candelabra on the dining table in a way that made me want to tell the world how long she had made me stretch to make her look good. By noon, I understood the size of the hole I'd been asleep to. The oven schedule overlapped, and pies that were meant to be cooled were still in the pans. I learned why a cook needs a second pair of hands, at least to plate at the pace 30 people require. I made bad decisions in a panic. I called the bakery on the other side of town and discovered there were no last-minute deliveries possible. I scoured the cupboard for an extra rolling pin like a man attempting to be resourceful and finding only his limitations. Back at the airport, Force Bus AM, the fluorescent light was surprisingly honest. My boarding pass was small and severe in my hand. A man in a uniform walked past, speaking into a headset about turbulence and gates. The sound blurred around the edges like static. I had never staged a departure like this before. There was no melodramatic music, only the clanking of a luggage trolley and the mechanical call of machines. A stewardess announced final boarding for Flight 442. I kept my eyes low. I thought about the scaled-down Thanksgivings we'd once had. 8 people, a potluck, laughter that slipped into comfortable quiet, and how those had been better for reasons beyond the size of the table. I thought of Ruby and her slow, polite smile that did not reveal how excluded she'd felt. I thought about the neighbor who said I was never meant for drowning. I finally understood drowning wasn't the absence of water. It was the absence of someone throwing a rope. A moment before the gate, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Carmen. "Where are you?" I thumbed back. On the plane, I don't know exactly what I've done. She replied with a single, fierce emoji and then, you did the right thing. Her certainty steadied me in a way no one else's had. Perhaps it was selfishness that put my suitcase over my shoulder and pushed forward into the line. Perhaps it was a necessary preservative. Maybe both. I passed through security with the urgency of a person who had made a choice and now had to live with its consequences. My boarding pass folded in my pocket was at once a ticket and a confession. I kept thinking of the oven timer back home and the cluster of aluminum pans waiting under plastic wrap like a frozen domestic battalion. At the gate, I stood for a moment and let the airport air wash over me. It was antiseptic and bright, a place suited for transitions. A woman with a small child offered me a seat. She did not know, no one did, the exact shape of the night that had led me here. She only saw a woman with a sundress in the middle of a fall sea of coats. The plane took off with the polite rumble of something used to being huge and full of small lives. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and watched the city lights unravel. The image of 30 plate settings sat in my mind like a photograph. Shining porcelain, the weight of utensils, napkins folded in careful triangles. I felt a cautious, foreign lightness in my chest. I had left a life of muscle memory and to-do lists, and I would have to face the after. But in that rare hush above cloud, in a small window seat, I allowed myself to imagine returning as someone who had learned how to say no. I pictured a different Thanksgiving the following year, smaller, shared, messy in the best ways. I knew toward the back of my mind that leaving, my form of small rebellion, would be amplified into gossip, into anger, into consequence. Vivien would be furious. Hudson would be humiliated. Carmen might be triumphant. Ruby would feel something else, perhaps relief, perhaps sorrow. For now, the plane steadied and the cabin lights dimmed. Outside, the runway lights folded into one constant stream. I folded my hands and breathed out, as if that small exhale could be the beginning of a new schedule, a new set of rules. There are moments in life when a single decision reframes the map. Booking the flight felt like one of them. The rest, the fallout, the confrontation, the rebuilding, would come like a second act I could not avoid. But in this quiet, with the small, ridiculous constellation of numbers on the boarding pass at my hip, I allowed myself to feel relief. If you're watching this, and you've ever been the person who holds everything together while the rest of the room applauds the result, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe if stories about change and boundary setting matter to you. I want to hear your country and know we're not alone in this. The sun rose into the Pacific like an enormous, obliging coin. I had a flight to finish and a life to reckon with, and both sat in my palms like something I had to learn to carry differently. The sun had hardly warmed the hotel balcony when my phone buzzed. For a second I thought it might be a message from a stranger, an airline update, a promotional text. But the name that lit the screen made my chest tighten in a way unrelated to the humidity. Hudson. I let it ring. The morning air smelled of plumeria and the ocean. Gulls argued with one another over some invisible prize out beyond the breakers. I had bought a cheap breakfast at the kiosk by the shore, coffee that tasted like memories of better things, and I sat with the sand between my toes, letting the knowledge of the morning at home unspool in my head. The note on the counter, the packed pans, the guests, the way that one sentence would ricochet through the family like a rock in a pond. When I finally answered, Hudson's voice was a thick, crabbed thing, part apology, part panic. "Where are you?" he asked. Not accusatory exactly. The tone was someone trying to find a thing that had been misplaced. "Somewhere humid," I said. "Hawaii, actually." There was a beat. "Isabella." "Yes?" He swallowed. "We're dealing with it." "Are you okay?" I asked. because he had to know that this wasn't about performance. It was about the scale of what he had been okay letting me carry. He hesitated. No, we burned the first batch of pies. Vivien is furious. People are asking where you are. I had no idea how many pans we needed. The sentence dissolved into static. They're mad at me and at you, and I don't even know. There's water everywhere and no one knows how to plate. You can do one thing for me, I said. Make a list. Call people and ask whose dishes you can reassign. Stop making decisions alone. Ask someone what's actually needed. Tell Vivien the pies with nuts can stay in the kitchen labeled and separate. Don't move them. For the child with the allergy, have one person designated, one set of utensils, and don't let people wander with plates near the dessert table. How do you know this? He said, bewildered. The question half praise and half reproach at my existing role. Because I do it. I didn't want to say, because I always have. Instead I said, delegate now. Ask Carmen to take over dessert staging. Call the bakery again. Ask for emergency rolls, not desserts. Something that doesn't require cooling. And Hudson, tell Vivien she can be furious, but not at me for steps she never volunteered to take. He was quiet after that, and I imagined him in the bright, two-ordered dining room where his mother's candelabra jutted like a tiny accusation. I allowed myself one small, private smile. It felt dangerous and delicious. Hudson's perspective, Thursday, 10:17 a.m. Standing in my mother's kitchen felt like standing at the controls of something I'd never learned to fly. Pans clattered, a casserole dish steamed, and the oven timer chimed with the metronome of my guilt. I had always taken pride in being the guy who could step into any social role, work, parent, handyman. But this time, was raw. Recipes I had watched in passing for years were now keys I could not quite turn. The language Isabella had used to describe her work, the timelines, the separate zones for allergen-free food, had been invisible to me until I held the manual upside down. I called Carmen. She answered with an edge that could cut tin. "You look like someone who's about to cry," she said. "I might," I admitted. "I'm sorry, Car. I didn't understand. You thought everything would snap into place because your wife is good at it," she said. "And she's not just good at it. She made it her unpaid job. Now own it, Hudson. Ask where to begin. Don't make things worse by improvising alone." I took her orders and I meant them. I began dividing tasks, took inventory of which dishes could be served cold, and deputized an aunt to tend the buffet. I walked to the porch to call people, to ask if someone could fetch the second slow cooker from a neighbor, to have an uncle bring disposable platters. Each call was a small patch over a large rent in the fabric we'd been pretending wasn't there. When I finally looked at my phone and saw Isabella's message, one photo of turquoise water, one line of text, "Tell Vivien the turkey is her problem now," I felt every layer of denial pull apart. Shame, mostly. It dawned on me like light that she had been responsible for the invisible work of 30 Thanksgivings for years. I had symbolically offered carving and wine, not seeing that the trophy ceremony required weeks of invisible scaffolding. That day I began to learn that love has a labor component, and that recognizing that component is part of being a partner. Back in Hawaii, I let him learn it on his feet and made myself small on the phone. Less an escapee showing off than a map maker outlining, step by step, what needed doing. Each instruction I gave him was a small act of trust. I believed he could learn. He believed I had abandoned him. Both things were true. The rest of the morning bled into a kind of controlled chaos. Vivien's outrage was a slow, theatrical thing, pearl-clutched and theatrical eyebrow lifts, as if the room were a stage where she had always held the primary role. "How could she?" she demanded to anyone listening. "How could she just leave?" That "how could she" had two directions. the moral condemnation hovering over my head from people who saw departure as abandonment, and the begrudging recognition whispered by cousins and aunts that someone, somewhere, had been doing far more than they had realized. Carmen, to her infinite credit, spoke up. She listed concrete things: how many hours she had seen Isabella on her feet, how many family emergencies she had smoothed over without complaint, the invitations Isabella had accepted for the family's sake. Her voice was not shrill. It was a scalpel. "You say she left," Carmen said, turning to Vivien in a quiet that made everyone lean in. "But maybe she left because she had been the ground for everything for years, and no one offered to hold it. We made it her job because she is damn good at it, not because it's fair." The room hummed. Some faces flushed. Some lowered their eyes. Ruby, who had been on the edge of the fray, uninvited some years ago, inadvertently hurt, sat with her hands folded and watched as if measuring a new temperature. She didn't speak immediately, but later her small quietness would matter more than any outrage. Vivien's voice, when it came, had a fragile pitch. "Isabella always did things so well," she began, trying to conjure tenderness into the argument. "But that doesn't mean I wanted her to leave us at Thanksgiving." "In practice," Carmen said, "that's what you did. You folded that into expectation." It wasn't an attack. It was a naming. Names matter. I had pictured divorce courts and formal reprimands in my head, that someone would label me selfish or cowardly, and the stamp would stick. Instead, what happened was messier. There were people who admonished me. There were people who called with concern. There were social murmurs that traveled the neighborhood for weeks. I received texts, some harsh, some supportive. A couple of people with loud opinions pronounced that I had abandoned the family, as though the family were a single organism and I had been its duty. Carmen and Ruby, and even Mrs. Suzanne, fielded the worst of those messages like a shield. A day into my escape, a cousin, indefinido on the exact name in the timeline, posted a thread on social media criticizing me. It wasn't the smartest move. Her fingers misunderstood context for commentary. The internet, as it tends to do, took a kernel of drama and let it sprout judgment. The blow that stung was quieter. A family friend I had known since college sent a message asking if I had checked with Hudson before leaving. The implication stung, abandonment couched as concern. I replied once. Hudson knew. Then I didn't engage further. The fight wasn't mine to win online. The real confrontation came at the house 2 days later when I returned. I had bought a return ticket the minute I'd had a sense that our marriage needed more than a text. It was not a gesture of surrender, so much as a bridge I was willing to cross if Hudson had learned how to meet me halfway. I stepped back into our kitchen and the air tasted like dish soap and a faint caramelized sugar. The counters were cleared except for a slow cooker and a stack of disposable platters. The house had that particular smell of people who had rationed apologies and planned future defenses. Vivien stood in the dining room with a look that mixed triumph and concession. She had the sort of face that was hard to read, fur-lined armor edged by small gestures of civility. "Isabella," she said, and there was formality in the word as if qualifying it for a receipt. "I saw the photo," I said. "Hudson sent it." She blinked. "I was upset," she said. "We were all upset." "You were furious," I agreed. The sentence landed between us like a ledger balancing. And I understand that. We had guests and expectations and confusion. But I left because you had never asked to share the work before. You had never expected it would take up anyone else's life but mine. Vivien bristled. "I asked," she said. "I asked your husband." "And he said he would carve the turkey and open the wine," I replied, and this time my voice did not waver. "He told me he'd help. He didn't. That's partly why I left." Truth can be a difficult friend. There were tears, on my end and hers eventually, but not the temporary performative sort, the kind that make your shoulders hurt afterward. Carmen stood near the doorway like a lighthouse. She had taken over a lot of the immediate logistics when the kitchen had flamed into collapse. She had also become my unlikely public advocate. "You can be furious, Vivien," she said, "but you don't get to be furious at the person who carried your table for years without asking permission or offering help. We should be asking ourselves how we set up systems that relied on one person's unpaid labor." Carmen's words changed the tenor. People who had been angry with me now squinted at their own assumptions. Some apologized. A few did not. That's the nature of anger. It keeps a file open. Ruby came forward quietly then, and she did not speak about the past exclusion. Instead, she offered a small, practical plan. A list of people willing to bring dishes next year, a suggestion that we find a local caterer for the large tables, and an invitation for the family to rotate hosting responsibilities. Vivien, affronted as she was, did something I had not expected. Over the next few weeks, she reluctantly agreed to a middle course. She would not host the large family dinner on her own anymore. She hired a caterer for an upcoming holiday event, an arrangement that allowed her to continue her role as the social architect without expecting me to perform the labor she enjoyed commodifying. It was not a perfect solution, but it broke the unspoken contract we had all been adhering to, that Isabella's competence would carry the cost of our social life. To the neighbors and extended family who had wanted a scapegoat, the news was confusing. Some clutched their judgments like a talisman and refused to engage in nuance. Others, people who had seen me in the kitchen at midnight, who had once accepted my casserole with no comment, stepped forward in quieter ways. Mrs. Suzanne stopped by with a casserole that first Saturday and sat with me on the stoop while we ate. She made me laugh more in 1 hour than I had in months. "You didn't drown," she said, half teasing, half steadfast. "You learned to swim with no one watching." Hudson and I had the slow, painful conversations that relationships need after a lurch. He did not make grand promises he could not keep. Instead, he did the things that quietly matter. He scheduled a day off to practice holiday prep with me months before the next season. He showed up in the grocery store aisles and loaded heavy boxes with his own hands. He learned to ask what needed doing rather than offering gestures that skirted labor. He took on the dishwasher duty for 2 weeks after I returned, not as penance, but as practice. One afternoon, a month after the incident, he surprised me at the kitchen table with an envelope. Inside were 2 things: a plane ticket, return to Hawaii, and a note. The ticket was not a performance. It said he had booked us space on a week when both of our schedules were less crowded, a small gesture toward reclaiming something we had both lost. The note was shorter. "I'm sorry I saw you as the machine before I saw you as my partner. Let me learn." He meant it in the way that made me trust him. He had arranged for a cooking class for us to take together, something he thought might help him not be comically inept about turkey timings. And he had spoken to Carmen about creating a shared timeline for next year's holidays. Learning can be a slow, half-finished project. Hudson misstepped and apologized again in uneven human ways. I did not hold out for perfection. I held out for accountability. The difference is a small, seismic thing. Accountability looks like showing up even when it is inconvenient. A year later, November 1 year later, we had 8 people around our table that year. Ruby sat on my left, grinning and comfortable in a way I had not seen in years. Carmen arrived with a dish she had made without my input, because that was the arrangement. Each person brought something they liked, nothing more. Hudson roasted the turkey with an odd kind of concentration, checking temperatures and basting at intervals. He'd practiced. He'd asked me for help ahead of time. Neither of us kept score. The gravy, his own experiment, turned out better than mine had on a few previous years, and he laughed in surprise at his own competence. We had agreed, 2 months prior, to assign roles. Vivien insisted on bringing the candelabra and a small salad. She arranged place cards with careful fingers and allowed Ruby to choose the playlist. Carmen handled dessert coordination, but she also took on a quiet role of mediator. If something in the flow began to fold into old expectations, she barked reminders as if training a kitchen staff. We instituted one rule. No single person would take on more than one major station. Someone could be the turkey carrier, someone else the stuffing attendant, someone the dessert porter. We hired quietly a helper for the more demanding tasks, someone local who was compensated for their hours, who moved through the kitchen like a professional, and whose presence relieved the invisible labor from being ours alone. That year, the table was noisier in a better way. Conversations started by the stuffing bowl meandered into family history and then into laughter about low-stakes things. The food was good. Not the immaculate restaurant-level spectacle Vivien had once dreamt of, but warm and messy and ours. Hudson carved with a steady hand. His opening of the wine bottles felt like an act among others rather than the culmination of everything. After dinner, we sat on the living room couch. The house smelled of citrus and roasting herbs. Vivien took my hand in a moment that was not theatrical. It was real enough to be awkward. "I missed having you at these," she said, her voice smaller and softer than I would have thought possible. "I missed being here too," I said. "I missed the family. I just couldn't be the only one." She looked at Hudson. "I could have helped. I didn't know how to ask." "You didn't have to," he said. "I should have learned earlier." His fingers squeezed mine in a quiet, tangible promise. Not all things healed immediately. There were relatives who remained suspicious of the change, who grumbled when they had to bring dishes for the first time in decades. There were awkward moments in future holidays when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, and we had to remind people of the rules. Boundaries are not a single event. They are a repeated practice. But this wasn't naive optimism. This was slow, stubborn labor, much like the work of a kitchen. Ruby, who had once been uninvited without comment, became one of the people who voluntarily brought her own pie with a small label. Nut-free. She accepted the place at our table not with fanfare, but with a softness that made me grateful I had stayed true to myself. Vivien, for her part, found the caterer sometimes a relief and sometimes a puzzle. Her social role was intact, but the cost to others was no longer externalized onto my shoulders. One small thing that mattered to me was how Hudson learned to talk about the work I did. He began to share stories, brief ones, mostly with friends, about the logistics of Thanksgiving, about the unseen hours that went into each course. He did not frame me as a martyr. He framed our relationship as a team. That language change mattered because it made the invisible visible. There were moments of tenderness that validated the harder parts. One night, months after our smaller Thanksgiving, Hudson came into the kitchen and set a small turquoise envelope on the counter. Inside was a plane ticket to the same Hawaiian shore where I had sat and breathed out months before. "For when you want to feel the swell of air again," he said, "I want to give you that time, not as recompense, but because you deserve it, and because I want to go with you." That ticket was not a transactional apology. It was a sign that he had listened long enough to alter his actions. When I took his hand in that quiet kitchen, the heat of the oven softened into something that felt steadier than spectacle. The aftermath changed me, too. Stepping away showed me that my identity was not tethered to others' comfort. That lesson was not an epiphany that erased every discomfort. It was, instead, a slow unlearning of the way my competencies had been used as wallpaper, a necessary backdrop for other people's good times. I began to protect my time more deliberately. I learned to say no in ways that were kind and firm. I began on holiday planning lists to write my needs down as if they were part of the menu. 1 day off, 1 helper, 2 people to prep, a plan for allergens noted in bold print. I also learned to hold my own anger without letting it do the work of a rhetorical weapon. Anger can be useful. It tells you where a boundary has been breached, but it can also become a habit. I found a steadier voice that named needs without weaponizing shame. Sometimes viewers ask whether what I did was rude or selfish. I can answer only from my life. I left because the cumulative weight of 5 years had become intolerable, and because no small incremental change was offered voluntarily. I left not to punish, but to puncture the expectation that my labor was free. Your life will ask different things of you. My story is not a blueprint. It is a map of one woman's breaking point and the slow work of repair. If you are in that hard place, carrying things no one else has asked for, smoothing over edges so the room can shine, remember 2 truths. 1. You are not obligated to be the unpaid backbone of other people's performances. And 2, change is possible, often painfully incremental, but honest. Ask for help before you reach the point where you feel you must escape to be heard. And if you do need to step back dramatically like I did, know that people will have reactions, angry, relieved, ashamed, and that the work after is where true change happens. A year on, in quieter moments, I admit I miss the old kind of Thanksgiving. The perfect platters, the way people's faces lit up at the first bite. But I do not miss the way it demanded everything of me alone. We traded perfection for presence, spectacle for belonging. The table is smaller now, and it holds more laughter. There are more hands folding napkins and fewer shoulders hunched in secret. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to set a boundary to protect your own life, please share one small boundary you set in the comments, where you're watching from, and the thing you said no to. Let's make a map of honesty together. If you want more stories about messy, hopeful change, subscribe and join the conversation.